The following is an interview with Stephen Wisser, a graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania who is studying neuroscience. The topic of this interview are psychedelics and hallucinogenic drugs. We start by discussing some of the history, moral, and cultural baggage. We move on to talk about psychedelics use in post-traumatic stress disorder, treatment-resistant depression, and addiction, and then talk about some of the mechanics of what happens on a trip and what happens in someone's brain while they are on a trip. We discuss different types of psychedelics and what they do. We talk about the legal implications. We also discuss the difference between hallucinating and the neuroplasticity and whether or not there is a distinction between the two or if the two come as a coupled pair. We end by talking about our own personal beliefs and whether or not we would choose to partake in psychedelics, either for recreational or therapeutic purposes. Hi, Stephen. Thank you for joining me on my first ever interview style post. It is really exciting to have a neuroscientist who is willing to sit down and share a small snapshot of their expertise.
Well, thank you very much, Leni. I am honored to be your first guest, and if this takes off and you have a like a podcast spinoff of your blog and you're up there charting in the iTunes charts with the Daily and the Joe Rogan Experience, I will be honored to have been the first guest of your esteemed podcast spinoff. So thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to our discussion today.
Yeah. So Stephen and I studied together as undergraduates at Hamilton College, where he got his Bachelor's of Arts in Neuroscience. Stephen had a tendency to pop up in various corners of my life while we were at Hamilton. He started the amazing Aquaponics Club, which was so fun to be a part of. And for a time, I believe I was your physics lab TA.
That's correct, yep.
Once we mutually discovered that we really rival each other concerning eclectic fascinations, you and I started having so many conversations. I know you have exposed me to so many new ideas and realms of interest, and today's conversation is no exception. We're going to talk about psychedelics from a neuroscientist perspective. It's a topic that I know so little about and have no personal experience in. So could you open us up to the topic a little more, Stephen? What are we going to talk about today? What do you study while pursuing a doctorate at the University of Pennsylvania?
Absolutely. Yeah. So as you've said, I am currently a PhD student at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. So that's where roughly I am joining you today. I should give two disclaimers, really before we start, especially with a, shall we say, politically charged and sometimes thorny subject as psychedelics. The first is that I have just started my PhD program here, so I am by no means an expert. I have not even committed to a lab yet, so take everything I say, with a little bit of a grain of salt, as they say. And if in a couple years I end up going down this psychedelic research rabbit hole a little bit more professionally, maybe we can circle back and do like a follow up. Where have the audience? Where's he gone? Sort of thing. And at that point, I might be comfortable speaking a little bit more comfortably. But so I do want to say that I am not an expert at all, but I have read a little bit about the literature and have started to synthesize a couple of ideas. So I'm happy to be as we say in the field, preliminary data, not quite something you're really able to stand behind yet. The second disclaimer is that I am not, nor will I ever really be, a medical professional. I'm not, going to go on and endorse go talk to your doctor about this. But I just feel that should be said. I'm not looking or striving to give any medical advice. So with those two caveats, I think we can maybe go in a little bit here. So what is my experience? So I'll get into this a little bit, later bit down the road in terms of what my connection is to psychedelics. Really kind of started with a trip I took to Peru. I'm going to say this was end of middle school, maybe beginning of high school. I don't exactly remember when, but my more scientific interest really started this past year. So very briefly, for those who are unfamiliar, this is really how a lot of graduate school and PhD programs in the sciences work. Your first year, which is what I've pretty much just wrapped up, you do, in addition to taking some classes, what's known as a rotation, where you literally rotate in a couple different labs in what is essentially kind of like a speed dating scenario. You do a little bit of a research project, but the overall objective is to get an idea for the boss, the principal investigator, or the PI, as it's called in the lingo, and what that lab is like, and of course the research topic. And so this past spring, I did a rotation in the lab of Greg Corder, who is a professor here at the University of Pennsylvania. He is really kind of an opiates person, but is starting to venture into the psychedelic space. And so, he and I started to get to talking, and I mentioned, I really like to rotate with you, Greg. And he was very happy to have me on board, and I was very happy to have the opportunity to do that. So I worked with this gentleman here, Dr. Greg Corder, for a couple months, and on a psychedelic project that was really focused on psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms. And the project I was involved with him was really from a PTSD sort of a context that was exclusively done in mice. But for a couple reasons, I won't really talk about that today. If I end up joining his lab professionally and then working with him, we can maybe circle back in a couple years and talk about that more. But today, I just thought, I would basically talk a little bit about what I have learned over the years through both like a popular science perspective and also from more of a more professional, rigorous neuroscience perspective. We can talk a little bit about basic history, some very basic science mechanisms. We won't go into the very nitty gritty mechanisms. And then of course, we'll talk about, therapeutics, why, people might be interested in doing this. And this is actually might be, I don't know if it'll be my favorite section, but it's certainly the most current. We'll talk about the legal status, because literally in the last couple of days, there have been some kind of unique and pretty cool developments in the legal space. And I'll end by giving maybe a couple of predictions of where I think this psychedelic space, is going to go. But again, it's not a super duper informed opinion, as I have not committed to a lab yet. So that is, I think, what at least I thought we would, end up talking about today.
So one of the most important things in science is being able to communicate why the common person should care. So why should the common person care about psychedelics and psychedelics research? What is the impact of psychedelics on the person who doesn't plan to use them recreationally or doesn't need them for some medicinal or therapeutic use?
Yeah, that is a good question. I think the most simplest answer is it is so exciting and new that just by default of so many interesting experiments and research being done, the public is bound to hear about this through CNN or MSNBC. It is going to make popular science. I thought this was kind of a funny term, but it's something I've heard actually in many different contexts. I would describe psychedelics as the quote unquote sexy science. Like, you'll hear people say, oh, funding is really hard for me to get. I'm not doing like sexy science these days. And what that just really means is it is a hot field with a lot of potential for growth and kind of exciting things. And so I feel fairly certain, as do many people who are well more qualified than myself, that some of as we start to experiment a little bit more and really try to, unearth these mechanisms of psychedelics, there are going to be new drugs that are going to be psychedelic based. So I think, folks will be hearing about that in the news, on a commercial. One example I'd like to give is Narcan. So this is not a psychedelic based drug at all. You may have heard of this. It's kind of this, someone calls it a miracle drug that is essentially to help somebody come out of a opiate overdose. Right. So it's being very popular in cities that are plagued kind of with heroin and fentanyl and all these very nasty opiates that are on the streets. And I am willing to bet a couple years ago, some people thought when this came to market, Narcan, this is going to be kind of a niche drug that, maybe only EMTs and firefighters are going to ever have to use. And just a couple weeks, maybe months ago, the FDA gave the green light for Narcan to be over the counter. Just like I'm sure there were people who thought, this is kind of a one-off thing. They didn't predict, 15, 20 years ago, there would be such an opiate epidemic as there is now. And now here we are. It's an over-the-counter drug that I would be willing to bet many households have at least heard of. I think a similar thing might happen with psychedelics. It's kind of this small field. I think it is going to get very big very quickly as more mechanisms and drugs are created. That we might have somewhat of a Narcan situation where something that's small first might eventually be over the counter and an everyday sort of a situation. And for more conditions that apply to the common person, shall we say. But I also think the second part of this is maybe a little bit more philosophical in nature. Some of this psychedelic work, if you ever hear someone who is on a quote unquote trip for acid, LSD, or whatever psychedelic they're using, they have just the bizarrest of experiences. And the other angle that psychedelics research is going in addition to therapeutics for all sorts of conditions, is kind of these fundamental basic neuroscience questions of what is consciousness, and how do these series of like electrochemical interactions create what we know as everyday life. And because they are so disruptive, these psychedelic drugs, they are very uniquely positioned to allow neuroscientists to look into like this overarching question of consciousness and how do we define that. So that's what I think the common person might be interested in. But I can assure you, someday you'll be watching your evening television and here comes a for-profit private sector advertisement, of which, this is a side note here for you, I believe the U.S. is one of the only developed nations that actually allows drugs to be advertised as commercials. So take that for what it's worth. You might see something one day, and if there'll be fun people walking around. And if you look a little bit closer, oh my gosh, is that a ketamine derivative? Is that psilocybin as the active ingredient? So you'll be seeing it. I don't know how soon. I think there's a lot of work to be done. Certainly the private sector is seeing lots of money in this, rightfully so. And my concern is they're maybe moving a little bit too quickly, but eventually, one way or another, you'll see some products on the market for sure.
Psychedelics and drugs in general carry a lot of historical, moral, and cultural baggage. So could you tell us a bit about the history of psychedelics and maybe give us some context for the mainstream view on them?
Yes. So as somebody from a Western society and a shall we say, maybe a developed nation, it seems like psychedelics are pretty new. I mean, certainly in the last couple of years, but even if you're willing to go back to like the counterculture days of the 70s, where people were using LSD, which would be classified, by the way, as a psychedelic. That is still very, very new in the grand scheme of things. A lot of South American indigenous cultures have been using these psychedelic compounds for years, like thousands of years. I'm not exactly sure how far back it's gone, but thousands is the correct scale. And I guess one of the most immediate examples that comes to mind is like Peruvian and other South American societies on like ayahuasca. I'm not sure if you or your listeners are familiar with ayahuasca. It's this sort of local tea, a hallucinogenic tea that is brewed from roots of certain trees. And when I was in Peru, as I mentioned a number of years ago, we did some hiking in the Peruvian Amazon, and our guide had gone on an ayahuasca trip and kind of talked about his experience, and he saw snakes, and God himself apparently showed up to this trip. But it was just the darndest thing. And as a young, impressionable youth at the time, I just thought this was really shocking and fascinating. So these cultures have known, for a while that there's something special here, and they traditionally have been used in religious ceremonies. It's a way to open up their soul to the gods. But really, in the 1950s, I would say that the U.S. and the Western world, shall we say, started to tune into these things a little bit. So the story goes, Humphrey Osmond, who was actually the individual who coined the term psychedelic, and Aldous Huxley, these are both two people who were very, very big pioneers in the psychedelic space. They met with a J.P. Morgan vice president, Gordon Wasson. And they were talking with him, and he, with I believe a fair amount of funding behind him, decided, I'm going to go to Mexico. I believe he went and try this myself. And so he finds his journeys, taking him, like I said, I believe to Mexico, and he has a mushroom trip. So he has a magic mushroom. So he's ingesting psilocybin, the active ingredient here. And this is in 1955. He comes back to the States, is talking with his, fancy friends over lunch about this. Wow, it's so great. And a very famous, I couldn't find this online. In fact, I'm not sure it's electronically available, but a very famous Life article, which at the time, I'm not sure if they're as popular as they were back then, but it's a company of Time magazine, or was in 1955, detailed this vice president, this JP Morgan guy, his trip in great detail. And it had some kind of absurd heading like, the white man's first time with a magic mushroom, which was likely not true, but was likely probably the first time this sort of thing had been published for the masses. And so a lot of scholars, shall we say, will say that this life piece, detailing this vice president's well publicized magic mushroom trip, really started kind of this counterculture movement and hippie ordeal, shall we say, of the 50s, 60s, 70s. And so one of the, I don't know if he read this, but it certainly, I'm sure, influenced him. There are many people who, kind of read this article and said, this sounds interesting. Let's look into this from more of a scientific lens, and maybe not just some guy tripping and, we're hearing about his encounters. The single most person who I must mention, I believe by law, is Timothy Leary. And this is a gentleman who, even if you have no interest in neuroscience, you might have heard of. He was a very, very eccentric and pretty controversial neuroscientist. He was a Harvard researcher, and he was known for being kind of one of the pioneers in the first wave of psychedelics. I should say we're in the second wave now, as everybody is calling the Renaissance. Timothy O'Leary did some really controversial stuff with LSD. It was alleged that he took psychedelics with his students as they were doing things. You can Google him and some crazy stuff will come up. His one of his more famous controversial experiments is the Good Friday experiment, where I think he literally gave like LSD or magic mushrooms to people during a Good Friday service on April 20th. And, wanted to see like, how would they react? Would they speak to God? Would God speak to them more during their magic mushrooms trip? And it got a little out of hand. Somebody apparently ran out of the church and they had to go chase him down. It was a whole ordeal. But suffice to say that he was not the best from a PR perspective. And so he was fired. And then pretty much, but he was tuned in to psychedelics and made it his mission to really promote them. Was famous for having this saying, turn on, tune in, and drop out. And, was really encouraging. Oh, you don't need to go to college, just take these drugs, drop some acid and your consciousness will open up. You'll have everything you need to know. And so he was really the poster child for this counterculture. Really, really upset Richard Nixon and a lot of the leadership at the time. You can see how in a democratic society that has a functioning government, someone walking around encouraging people to drop out and just tune in to the drugs is maybe not the best. And so Richard Nixon was not a fan of him. Was purportedly called him the most dangerous man in America at one point, and eventually I think they had to be creative in terms of how they arrested him. I think he was eventually arrested for marijuana possession at the border. It was ironically not initially for psychedelics, but needless to say, and I should have mentioned at this time, psychedelics, all these drugs were legal. They were kind of new compounds. LSD was synthesized by Albert Hofmann accidentally. That's a funny story we can talk about later if we would like. But needless to say, by 1970, the Controlled Substances Act was enacted, which essentially set up the DEA scheduling system for drugs that we know and are familiar with today. And with this 1970 passage, all psychedelics, including LSD, psilocybin, they were banned. And so it was arguably a very political move, but that is pretty much what started in the 70s, and then they went underground for a little bit. So that's I would say the beginning history up to maybe the 1970s with our dear friend Dr. Leary.
So I was meaning to ask, this Life article,
Yeah.
was it negative or apprehensive, or was it really just saying, hey, here's an interesting thing, let's look into it?
I think it was a pretty positive slant. It certainly enough to get people to think, oh wow, this is something we should do, ourselves or look into scientifically. So I do think it was. I have not read the article myself, but I do think it was a promoting PR. Look at this new thing. Let's try to figure it out. Sort of an article as opposed to sort of apprehension, because at that time, it, as the title suggested, it was the first time a Western person had tried this, so it was new. It didn't have the negative connotation of dropout culture and drugs and such that it went on to have. So I think it was positive at the time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So separating recreational use from the picture, can
Mm-hmm.
you tell us a bit about the history of how psychedelics came to be studied in medicine and for therapeutic use?
Yes. Yeah. So this is, as I kind of alluded to before, we are arguably in this second wave of psychedelic research. It took a good couple decades off. In the early 2000s, I would say is probably the timeline where most people, decades from now, will point to in history books and say, "Ooh, this is when it started again." But what's happened now is a little bit more scientifically rigorous experiments. So, this Good Friday experiment that Timothy O'Leary and some colleagues were doing at Harvard, a lot of those were like really kind of clinical and leaning into this hallucinogenic aspect of the drugs. And what does this make us do? The research now is focusing a little bit more on some serious like brain studies, doing things in animal models and using like really fancy like 2 photon microscopes, which you can, I'll take my word for it, is kind of the new hot technology of these days. I also think a lot of the experiments, and maybe partially the reason why psychedelics are having another renaissance, is because of the technology we have these days. MRIs, what was that? In the 1970s, there was no real way to kind of, with some sophisticated tools, look in the brain and answer some of these questions. And so I would argue this story starts probably with two people. There are many others, and I do apologize for not listing them, but these are, for the time we have, the two biggest people that you should probably know about. The first would be Roland Griffiths. He is a professor at Johns Hopkins down in Baltimore, and probably so he was famous, I believe, before this, but what put him on the map for psychedelics experiment was, most people would probably argue, his 2006 study on spirituality, where it was purely clinical. They gave I think it was 36 or around that number, healthy, well-educated, and that's a key factor actually, participants, psilocybin. So they gave them a pill. They weren't having raw mushrooms, which this does, I should say, grow naturally, by the way. And if you're interested in reading a little more about that, that's definitely the jurisdiction of Paul Stamets, the best mycologist in the U.S., I would argue. But so Roland Griffiths, he did this study where people in a pill form ingested psilocybin. There was placebos involved, so people didn't know exactly what they were getting. And it was well done. It was rigorously done and published in a well-respected, peer-reviewed journal. And they found that there were the participants. This is all self-reporting, but they all positive changes in their attitude and behavior. What was really interesting is they, I don't know exactly how they recruited these people, but they had like friends of these subjects also involved in the study. And so they like called them up and said, your neighbor Jimmy, I think you knew he was doing this magic mushroom experiment. How's he been? And they found that, neighbors, so people who didn't have the psychedelic experience, were able to actually see noticeable changes in the people who did. So this was kind of a way to verify and say, oh wow, it's not just something internally, it's a real change in their attitude and behavior. And so he probably broke the ice, I would say, with this. I don't know exactly the specific timing of this, but then a good couple years later, in terms of a little bit more, right? So that's still clinical. This is all self-reported stuff, which is good and neat and can have a lot of statistical power, but it's not looking at like brain activity per se. The person to do that was Robin Carhart Harris. And at the time he was in England and did some really cool fMRI studies. This is magnetic resonance imaging. It's a very, very common brain scanning technique where you can literally see brain activity, not in the best detail, but it is pretty good, such that a lot of conclusions and experiments are done with this sort of technology. And he found for the first time some like actual brain activity evidence in response to psychedelics. Specifically, he was also focusing on psilocybin. And he found that when his participants took psilocybin, when they were starting to, oh, I'm having a trip now, when they were able to say that and they were, seeing some other signs of a psychedelic trip, these interesting brain regions that are known as the default mode network were decreased. And all you really need to know for the sake of this is these couple brain regions that have been classified into the default mode network are, as the name implies, like a default level of activity. So when you are at rest, not like consciously thinking or speaking or listening or focusing really hard, these brain regions in the default mode network are on. And he found that when these participants had psilocybin, there was a decrease in this kind of default state, and which was quite unsurprising. So like like you could say it was like almost a signature of their guard was let down, right? Like the default brain regions that are there controlling some things, they were turned down. And so their conclusion was that psychedelics sort of promote and I'm quoting directly here, a state of unconstrained cognition. And this kind of goes along with the general idea of psychedelics that they turn off this filter. We are functioning adults and children of people of society. That is a good thing, I would say, for functioning in society and for having a good life. But having this filter removed allows you to open up, other levels of consciousness and maybe think a little bit differently. And this is done literally by psilocybin, which turns down this default mode network, these brain regions responsible sort of for this filter. So to that degree, that really got people excited. Robin Carhart-Harris has since moved to the US. He is working at one of the UC schools, I believe, in California. I was very fortunate to hear him speak at a symposium just a couple months ago at Penn, right here in Philadelphia. And it was really, really quite exciting. I mean, I'm not exaggerating when I say when this field blows up, he will be the equivalent of like what Newton was to physics, or who's a famous person, Leni, Stephen Hawking, like
Einstein.
Yeah, exactly. He will be one of those founders of this new wave. So this really got people excited, and with some initial MRI evidence of these drugs are doing something. People have gone in all sorts of directions, and I see the three biggest types of research that we're seeing now that are being done in humans, but also in some mouse models to really try to work out the brain circuits involved, are aimed at using psychedelics to treat PTSD, people with treatment-resistant depression, and then addiction. So it's getting a lot of attention in the addiction space. Some crazy articles I've read with so much as just one, psychedelic experience, cold turkey, people will stop smoking, or I just no longer feel the urge to drink at night. It's pretty amazing. So that's I'd say where we are now.
I'm going to throw a two-part question at you.
Okay.
So
all right.
First, what happens on a trip experientially? Are there stages of a trip? And then following that, what happens on a trip mechanically? Are there times during a trip that see more or less brain activity, or see different types of brain activity?
Yeah. So point one, I am not very well read on a lot of the clinical literature. A lot of my interest in what I was doing with Dr. Corder was on mice, so is animal models. So I don't. It's very, very hard to infer because they can't really speak to us. What it's a shame, I know what they are feeling. There's some little indications that we as neuroscientists can use to say, ooh, they're having a psychedelic experience. So I don't know personally. Also, I have not personally used these drugs, so I cannot speak from experience. But also, the accounts of a psychedelic experience that I have read about are just shocking. And it is apparently, again, from someone who has not used these class of drugs, very, very, very difficult to put into words, just because it is an experience like no other. For those who are interested in reading a little bit more about this, or for psychedelics in general, I would highly recommend Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind. It is an excellent book, and he is really a food journalist, but he decided, for reasons that he gets into in his book, to write about psychedelics. And he, at his own admission, uses psychedelics, several different kinds, and each chapter kind of works through which ones he uses, and then writes about his experience. And I will say he is an excellent writer. It was really a nice treat to see someone who has a great command of the English language try to put into words his psychedelic experience. And even he struggled because it's just apparently undescribable, literally undescribable. You just can't talk about it. There's another good book I would recommend, Hallucinations by Oliver Sacks, who is a very famous neurologist who was the subject of a really cool Awakenings, a movie that featured Robin Williams. It's a great film, and it is a true story, by the way. He also talks about, Oliver Sacks, that is, talks about his experience using, I think it was acid. And I remember there was a passage that stuck with me. He just kept seeing the color purple and tried to describe it on a wall. And it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. It was just, so, you fixate, you really get in depth here. Michael Pollan's biggest takeaway is you connect with nature on a much more serious level than, I don't know, if you were maybe out, have a fire outside, drinking a couple beers and you're feeling a little buzz. It's not that, he can assure us. But and I'm sure folks who are listening to this who maybe have used these drugs will be laughing right now, because it's someone who is psychedelic naive is definitely not qualified to do that. So that's all I'm going to say about that. And I don't really know much about what is happening from a brain level. I do know that these folks like Robin Carhart-Harris, who are doing these fMRI studies, there is definitely what we would call neural signatures of brain activity that are happening, such as a decrease in the default mode network, where they could say, by looking at the scan, ooh, this person is probably having a psychedelic experience right now. So that's all I know about that. That might have been more than you wanted to hear. So I apologize, because I had nothing really to say from personal experience besides read Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, and Hallucinations by Oliver Sacks. Mechanistically, I may be a little bit more well-versed with that. What is happening here is essentially a major reset of the brain. The official neuroscience word for this is plasticity. There's a lot of things that induce plasticity. Learning, is a big one. In fact, learning is a type of plasticity. This essentially just means that your neurons are rewiring. They're changing their connections, and psychedelics are very, very much so a plasticity promoting drug. Without getting too technical, they do this by literally growing little spikes on the end of neurons. So in order for neurons to receive information, they get their information from the preceding neuron through dendrites. These are the little ends that receive the signal. They receive the neurotransmitter. Psychedelics have been shown to increase the spine. So they literally grow more little offshoots on the dendrites. It would be like if you were having a house party and you had one pathway coming into your house, but then all of a sudden you paved a couple more pathways, or told people to walk on the grass. There's now many more pathways for people to get into your house. This is what psychedelics do. There are many more ways for neurons to have connections with other neurons by literally growing these spines on the dendrites. And so that's receiving a lot of work now. For the more scientifically interested, the person really pioneering this is Alex Kwan. He is a professor at Cornell, and I was able to have lunch with him this year. He was a lovely gentleman and doing some really cool dendritic spine work, literally imaging these spines in live mice who he's given a psilocybin injection to. So mechanistically, that is what's happening on a very, very small scale that leads to these wonderfully positive things, such as I no longer feel the urge to smoke, or I've tried all sorts of antidepressant medications, but I'm really struggling with depression. Now, I'm actually feeling better. That's what's happening on really a small scale to promote this plasticity, to give these incredible results.
Is this dendritic spine growth something that happens during the trip or
Mhm.
after? Is it long lived?
Excellent question. I can only speak to what I know of what happens in mice. Again, this is all from Alex Kwan's work, who he's really done a lot of those, asked a lot of those questions you are now asking. It is something that happens, I guess we could say, relatively quickly. So he found that so much as one day, so a 24-hour period after giving mice a psilocybin injection, he was able to see on his very fancy 2-photon microscope an increase in these spines. And what was really shocking is with just one dose, he saw that these spines that grew remained for as long as 1 month after the fact. I think he speculated that they might actually last longer. For whatever reason, they stopped the experiment at a month. But up until and including, a full calendar month from the time they injected psilocybin, they could still see those spines. So yes, it does suggest that these effects are long lasting. And this makes sense because some of the clinical work that we've seen, people sometimes need just one dose. They need one guided psilocybin session with a psychiatrist or what have you, and they're good for months. And maybe they come back in a couple months later, but it's not like some sort of another drug, or folks who are taking like I'm not sure, cancer medications where they have to do it regularly. They wake up, they have a cocktail of pills. Absolutely not. So it's simple, and can be long lasting.
Wow, that's crazy.
Yep.
So, can you tell me what are some different psychedelics and what do these different psychedelics do?
Indeed. So we'll get just a little bit into the weeds here, mechanistically. There are many types of psychedelic compounds. Probably the most famous, LSD. That's a synthetic psychedelic. It is not naturally occurring anywhere in nature. And then of course there are things like magic mushrooms. That's the psilocybin, which is really the main ingredient there. DMT, which many would say is the main ingredient in ayahuasca. At the beginning, I was talking about those South American ayahuasca cultures and ceremonies. That's another big psychedelic. Another one, and I might get a little bit of hate in the comments for saying this, is ketamine. And the reason I say I might get some hate here is it works on a different receptor than many of the so-called traditional psychedelics like LSD, MDMA. Another one, ecstasy, would be the street name, and they work a little bit differently than ketamine. However, ketamine has received a lot of clinical attention in the psychedelic space, and it does not quite, I think, have the cultural baggage that LSD does. So for that reason, it has maybe been studied a little bit more than some of these other drugs, because people don't feel as, my funding source is going to be upset with me, or what have you. It also is, it at high doses can produce hallucinogens. So ketamine is definitely a hallucinogenic drug, but they, by definition, psychedelics have to bind to and activate your serotonin receptors. So serotonin is a very widespread neurotransmitter that's involved in a lot of things, from eating to mood. And by definition, a psychedelic is a drug or a compound like psilocybin that binds to a serotonin receptor. Ketamine binds to something else, which is why some people say it's not a true psychedelic, but it is certainly being researched in the psychedelic space, and I would say rightfully so. So that is what they do. And then, of course, with this serotonin receptor binding, they cause a lot of things in the cell, which I should say we don't really understand that because it's still very new. And this is what I perhaps hope someday to maybe study a little bit. But one thing leads to the other, and then we get an increase in, just one example, these dendritic spines. But so that's what they're doing. It's serotonin mediated, but some other receptors maybe, if you want to talk about ketamine.
Stephen, what does the law say about all of this?
Yes. So it is federally illegal. So as per the 1970 the act, the Controlled Substances Act that dear Richard Nixon helped pen, they are legal because they are Schedule 1 drugs. So according to the DEA, Drug Enforcement Agency, the folks tasked with all this legal bureaucracy. Schedule 1 drug means that they have a high potential for abuse, and there is no currently accepted medical benefit. That is, and I would feel comfortable saying this, complete nonsense. This is another podcast if you're interested, but the DEA scheduling system is unfortunately very racist and is racially biased and motivated. Also, in the Schedule 1 compound list is marijuana. Under no circumstance would any, I would say, rational scientists or clinicians say it has, quote, no accepted medical therapeutical properties. That's just simply not true. And it's right up there with other things like heroin. Heroin is a Schedule 1 drug. I think that might fit the bill, but psychedelics and marijuana, I'm not really sure they fit the space. Will they one day be legal? I think they might. And depending on where you live, they are legal. So for instance, pretty recently, just 2 states, Oregon and Colorado, have decriminalized the use of, or I guess it would be the possession of psychedelics. Actually, I should back up a little bit. Several states have decriminalized psychedelics, but there is legal medical use in Oregon and Colorado. So if you are in those 2 states without a prescription, I even believe, you can legally go to a so-called psychedelic clinic and engage in a psychedelic session. It is a little bit cost prohibitive. I feel fairly certain, I don't know the answer to this, but I do not think insurance covers this, and they probably will not for a very long time. It's a little bit problematic, and it's not scientifically rigorous enough. When we're saying things like grams of medicine, I would like them to be a little bit more transparent. So I think this just means that it's in the beginning stages. Overall, it's probably a good thing generally that this sort of medicine in a more regulated way is starting to get into the general masses, shall we say. But I think it still needs some work. And so, but you can do it. You can do it. It is legal in those 2 states to do it. It will not be a crime, for you, and it's decriminalized if you choose to possess or dare I say grow these mushrooms. And yes, you literally can do that. The only final thing I will say is, and I just have to say this because it's so exciting. So as the recording of this podcast here, just a couple days ago, Australia became the first country in the world to essentially legalize psychedelics. This went into effect on July 1st. It is a little bit limited in terms of what they have legalized, and I'm still kind of catching up on the literature here, but essentially they allow psychiatrists and clinicians to prescribe MDMA. So this is ecstasy for PTSD, and psilocybin can be prescribed for treatment-resistant depression. And it seemed to be kind of specific, MDMA for PTSD, psilocybin for the depression, and you couldn't really deviate much. Kind of like what these clinics in Oregon and Colorado are doing. It's not just here's a drug that your pharmacist will give you, have a great day. It's going to be what a lot of the clinical trials have been doing, in that there is a counselor there, so somebody to walk you through this your session. So that is good, because I would not, as it stands right now, be in support of even via prescription giving a psychedelic over the counter and you're on your way. There should be somebody observing you with some sort of training who knows how to guide you. Because even though they're being hailed as great things, and I think there's a lot of reason for this optimism, we really should be cautiously optimistic. They're not for everybody. If you have some heart problems, this could be a real concern. So folks who have some cardiac issues should not be using these drugs, and also people who are schizophrenic or have some other mental health concerns. This can really cause some problems and can really trigger kind of a bad trip, shall we say. So legal in Australia. That's the hottest, most exciting news as of July 1st. Isn't that crazy?
Yeah. I mean, there is a lot of cause for caution and apprehension. So I guess my next question is, do you think we need to trip in order to get the therapeutic benefits? As in, do you think one day a pharmaceutical drug might be developed that can harness the therapeutic benefits of these hallucinogenic drugs? Or do you think that the hallucinations themselves are inseparable from the effects that produce the benefits?
Oh boy, Leanie. So that right there is the $1 million question. And I would say is the single question if people had to summarize it as to where the field is right now. And of course, there's players on both sides, extremely hotly debated. I mentioned there was a symposium at UPenn this just a couple months ago where a lot of the psychedelic leaders came in. One of these people, actually, he wasn't there, but I had lunch with him for another reason. Is Dr. Brian Roth down at in North Carolina. He's done a lot of like really small structural work on receptors for these psychedelics, and would arguably be one of the big people in the field today. And so I asked him, and he comes off, he's a little bit of an older gentleman, so I expected him to be a little more conservative and kind of shoot down my question. Oh, this young kid, what is he asking about tripping? And I was pleasantly surprised when I asked him this very question. Do you think the trip is the therapeutic part? Do you need to have this hallucinogenic experience? And he quite rationally and just matter of factly said, I don't know. He said, we're going to have to figure that out. I really don't think I know enough, or we at large as the scientific community know enough to really comment. So take it from Dr. Roth there, unknown at the time. There are definitely some people working on this. The biggest person who is at UC Davis right now is David Olson. His group is doing a lot of work that is trying to keep the therapeutic properties of psychedelics without the trip. So their lab is really focused on trying to get away this hallucinogenic aspect. I believe he is a chemist by training. So he is very uniquely positioned to literally modify the structure and the scaffolds of, shall we say, naturally occurring psilocybin to try to tweak little things here and there to make it non-hallucinogenic. And he has some very interesting results. I should say, I don't think he's used any of this in people. It's all mouse work that I've read about and seen him present upon. But he would definitely be of the mindset that you probably could, parse these two things. And then there are some people that say absolutely not. Even if you could do that, so let's do a hypothetical. A drug comes out of the Olson lab, and he teams up with a pharmaceutical, and they have a drug on market. It's a psychedelic derivative. They probably have to call it, like, it wouldn't be a true, naturally occurring psychedelic. They could say it has no hallucinogens. That might be totally true, and it has all these therapeutic effects. There are still going to be people that say, well, A, I'm skeptical of that, and B, I think part of my healing process, part of what I needed to do to overcome my alcohol addiction or my PTSD was to, as some people say, quote, face the demons that are seen in a trip. I mean, these are really powerful experiences. One of these studies I talked a little about from Roland Griffith's group out of Johns Hopkins, the big study in 2006, they 2/3 of the people of the participants says this was the single best experience or one of the top 5 best experiences they had in their life. And I mean, these are well-educated people who presumably have had a very fulfilling and enriched life, and they said this was the best. I mean, this is 2/3, so it's a powerful thing. And so some people will say, I think that needs to be there. That is what the healing was for me. That's great that you can make a drug that does all this stuff with dendritic spines and I'm not tripping. And that's just wonderful. But to really get the therapeutic, you need to have the hallucination. And I would say, I don't think these things are entirely separate. I do envision a world where there could be both. And I think that is also a good thing, because say what you will, about David Olson's work. This is, obviously the people who are pro hallucinations are not so jazzed with the stuff he's doing, but it's realistic what he's doing, because this is something that insurance and pharmaceuticals, and most certainly the FDA, would look at and say, now this is a drug we are willing to entertain. There's not a lot of liability. It has a lot of effects in a positive clinical sense. And that's the silver bullet, right? There's no real dangerous side effects, but it does something good. That there is a language of the FDA that they are going to want to see. And so I think it is very important for this sort of parsing activity to be done, even if that is not the dominant thing we will see on the market or in the landscape or even in the underground, psychedelic culture, so to say.
Now, I think it would be good to end by asking you about your personal thoughts on the use of these drugs.
Mm.
Would you use psychedelics recreationally? If they were illegal, would you consider using them therapeutically if a professional recommended them? Or if you suffered from some sort of treatment-resistant depression?
Yeah, that's a good question. I am a little bit conservative when it comes to these things. Perhaps that is some neuroscience training. Maybe it's just other personal reasons. So I personally don't think I would use them recreationally. Might that change when a lot more research comes out, perhaps that I've even done with my own hands, and I feel a little bit more comfortable? Perhaps, for instance, I know I'm probably in the minority here, especially having gone to a liberal arts school. I can proudly say I did not legally drink, underage in the U.S. And part of that decision that I made was motivated by the damage that ethanol can do, and the mechanisms that we know about alcohol. We have a decent idea, right, of what ethanol does. It binds to some different neurotransmitters than serotonin receptors like psychedelics do, but it's kind of well defined. It is most certainly toxic, but right, people can drink in moderation, and so I do have a alcoholic beverage, shall we say, here and there. And am I doing damage to my brain? Perhaps, but I'm not binge drinking, and I feel I'm making an informed decision about when to have an alcoholic beverage because I feel a little bit more comfortable with the mechanisms. I do not feel that way right now with psychedelics, and I would say probably the biggest thing that a lot of people point to is long-term effects. Maybe we could look at some of the people from the 70s who were in the so-called hippie culture and were dropping acid pretty consistently, and we could say, what happened to them? But that, of course, would be anecdotal. As far as I know, there's no longitudinal or long-term experiment that was started in the 70s before all the political baggage that is still ongoing. And so if we were to start that now, that's great. But it's only been really a handful of years that we've been in this scenario. So there are also no real long-term studies done yet, and that's also going to be, I think, a big thing for people feeling comfortable using this. So for me, I don't think I would recreationally use them. As I mentioned, I have not, and I do not see myself doing that in the foreseeable future. I would say, yeah, maybe, I'm a rule follower. I like to be a law-abiding citizen. So I certainly the illegality aspect of it plays into it. But if I were, visiting a friend or somebody in Colorado and, do you want to go to this psychedelic clinic with me? I still would probably say no. However, with the caveat of all that, I think if I suffered from something, I would definitely be open to it. I'm very blessed and grateful that I feel I have a pretty comfortable life in a variety of ways. So I don't see the need, to do that right now. But if a spouse or, someone, if I have a family down the road and my child was struggling with someone, or even a family member now, would I suggest this to them and say, well, at least talk with your physician about this, or at least let me give you a couple things to read and think about it. Would I do that? Absolutely. Absolutely. Because it is, as the clinical data has shown, very helpful for some people. It is also definitely not for everybody. And so it's not a decision, to take lightly. Probably not as dangerous as some of the other things out there. I'm not going to endorse this statement, but there are some people would say, it's not really addictive. There's some good evidence for that. So, right there, you could say, oh my gosh, alcohol and other things that do have an addiction tendency are way worse. And I would say some people might be true if they were to say that in the appropriate context and had some good facts to back them up. So I would say it's probably not the most likely thing to be abused because it doesn't really work on these traditional drug addiction pathways. But it is still not a decision that should be taken very light. Oh yeah, let me just have some mushrooms. Although of course people do that. And full disclosure, I am, as you're probably telling from this, a little bit more conservative when it comes to these things. So that's my thinking there. And I feel like I might know your direction here, but Leni, may I have the honor of returning the favor? Would you ever do a magic mushrooms, or would you ever consider growing them, or I guess any psychedelic in, let's say both, the same thing, both a recreational or even in a legally sanctioned, organ clinic? Where would you be on that?
Yeah. I think that I probably align largely with your thoughts.
Mm,
I am definitely a goody two shoes, and I love obeying the rules when they're the law,
that's
especially.
right.
And so I have no personal experience with these psychedelics. And recreationally, I just don't think I have the desire to do them, to have that experience. The therapeutic benefits are definitely interesting.
Hmm.
And like you were saying, if I had a family member or a friend who had a physician recommend this sort of treatment to them, I would certainly not want to dissuade them.
Hmm.
Would I want to take these in that situation myself? I don't really know. I think that personally, I do have a bit of fear about having a bad trip. The idea of hallucinating is just a little bit scary to
Sure.
me. But if there was something like this psychedelic derivative, like you were saying, where you don't actually have hallucinations, but you get the therapeutic benefits, that is
Hmm.
something I'm sure I'd be much more open to. This is probably something that I would want to talk to someone who I look up to spiritually and morally with. I would probably want to talk with my pastor,
Yep.
because what we do matters, right? It matters to someone important, God.
Yep.
So just making sure that it is a well thought out act and it is not something that I would regret or feel guilty for after the fact is
Hmm.
pretty important to me. But that is an interesting question. I'm not really sure how I would answer that. Currently, I don't have the need to answer that. So I'm sure that I could come up with an answer if I was in that situation. But it's a little bit trickier without having the need.
Yeah. Yeah, I think those are good things to be thinking. And I feel like I've been here, for the most part, talking about how great these psychedelics are, and I do believe that. But you bring up a very good point about like a bad trip and being scared about that. There is a term in the field. I don't really know who coined this, but it's known as set and setting. And the idea is that essentially your mindset and the setting, so where your physical headspace is, and then your physical location is one of the best predictors of if you're going to have a positive psychedelic experience or a bad trip. And so that's why there's some really cool images in some of these clinical studies of the patients with a blindfold over their eye, and it is not what you think of as maybe being where an experiment takes place. It is not a clean, sleek, white room that's not very inviting. It's not a traditional lab space. It's not even a doctor's office. They have like nice warm lights. They essentially have built a living room, and people are laying on a couch. There's lamps. There's paintings, there's pictures, and the whole idea is that people need to be comfortable and they need to be in a good place to do this. So certainly, if you're going in to a psychedelic experience with fear and anxiety and uncertainty, it's a little bit like a self-fulfilling prophecy. You will probably not have a good experience. That's what I'll say there. But and it seems like I think maybe we're heading the end here. I will say one final comment to muddy the waters. I'll be a little crazy. This comment is that psychedelics are not always just for people who have a condition they're looking to treat. I was at a psychedelic conference last spring, and one of the panels was a group of individuals who were in a clinical trial, and they spoke about their experience. There is the idea of a healthy normal, and one of these panelists was a healthy normal, meaning he was like what it seems like you and I are describing here. We don't have any serious problems that we're needing psychedelics to help us with. And he was, shocker, shocker, he's speaking at a psychedelic convention. He was for psychedelics for everybody. And it was so great, and was kind of taking the stance, even if you don't think you need them, it is really amazing. And, how much better could your life be? The sense from him that I took away and I will never forget is he said it completely rewrote the rules to life. And I didn't even know that, they needed to be rewritten. He said, I thought they were fine, but it just changed everything. And that was his endorsement, essentially of even a healthy normal could do this and potentially benefit. So I don't know, it's things like that make me kind of waver a little bit on my, I don't really think so. I don't know enough about it. I like you, I'm a little concerned. So would I have a bad experience and that would just, shut me down completely from this field and, from using again. So it's a thorny, very complicated topic in a variety of ways. But my hope and my prediction is that with this second wave, this renaissance of research in the psychedelic space that we are experiencing now, we'll be able to really get at a lot of these mechanisms, make ourselves as scientists more comfortable with saying things as, this is a potentially true, I said it, a true statement or a true fact. And it will make the public more comfortable about, we know how these work. They're predictable things to a degree. And I think that's probably the direction that the field will be going. And I think it will be exciting.
Yeah, this is a very complicated topic, both in research and culturally. So thank you for taking the time to give us a little window into this world.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a lot of fun. Always enjoy talking about this cool stuff. And thanks for the opportunity, and hope you and your audience enjoyed it.